Good evening. My name is Cynthia Demise. I'm the project manager of the new Pride Agenda. We thank you for joining us. We are a newly formed nonprofit focusing on education and advocacy in New York State. While we had planned to go in community in a variety of places around the state, obviously COVID came upon us, and we immediately pivoted to doing virtual town halls twice a month. We first began our efforts on COVID, 2 or 3 months, and we focused on isolation and mental health and health concerns, etc. And we then pivoted to other social justice issues, issues raised by Black Lives Matter. We've done a variety of town halls upstate, have been really interested in learning that so many of the problems going on in upstate towns, including Rochester and Buffalo, are challenges with interest in police reform, etc., are reflective of things going on in New York City. Perhaps responded to a little differently, but same struggles. We're about health, human service, civil rights, social justice. And I thank you for joining us once again. This is probably our 15th or 16th town hall. We're very excited by tonight because in addition to doing a great deal of public policy work regarding the state, in 2021, we are going to begin not only some local advocacy, but federal advocacy as well. And so it's of great interest to us to hear from our panelists and have a discussion about what kind of priorities, what kind of accountability we would like to ask of the new Biden administration and also of our New York State delegation. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We have Matt Foreman, who's the program director at the Haas Junior Fund. The Haas Junior Fund is the largest nationwide funder of civil rights and discrimination issues. And one of our funders, and we're very pleased to have him with us. Matt has done 30 years of work in New York City before working at Haas, based out of San Francisco, and was one of the former executive directors of Empire State Pride Agenda. And so I've known Matt as a friend for a long time. We have Senator-elect Samra Brooke, Brook, that is, Dutch, thank you, Amara. And basically, the senator-elect is from Rochester, and the senator has a background working on educational equality and issues associated with seniors and issues associated with climate change. She is a terrific ally of the LGBT community, and we appreciate her taking the time to join us and offering an upstate perspective. Thank you, Senator. Jason Starr. Jason Starr was a leader in the governor's office of Governor Andrew Cuomo, and he was the head counsel, actually, that worked on civil rights litigation and major policy and legislative issues, and was very well known either in person or by reputation for his influence on the second floor. Jason is now with the head litigator at Human Rights Campaign Fund, but a Brooklyn guy, so we trust that. And thank you for joining us. And then, of course, we have our board member, Amara Jones, who is facilitating tonight. And Amara is both a media and a national media and journalist and founder of Translash. And we're very honored to have her be a member of the board. And it's also London School of Economics. I love mentioning that, Amara. We're very pleased to have her intellect and commentary for this. I'm going to give it now to Ahmed to talk a little bit about the technical. I thank you, panel. I'll be taking lots of notes, and I'll join you a bit later. Ahmed.
Yes, awesome. Thank you, Cynthia. So we have a stellar lineup, and I'll take as little time as possible. I'm just going to be the tech guy, and so if you run into any problems, you can shoot me a chat in the function along the bottom of the screen. I'll try to troubleshoot. I'll also be siloing your questions to Amara. So it's supposed to be as interactive as possible. Please use the chat feature to ask questions or make comments, and hopefully we can get your questions addressed. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Amara for this great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed and Cynthia, and of course to everyone who is joining us tonight. There's lots to talk about because the agenda for our community in all parts of the state is an ambitious one. And of course, it's being impacted not only with what happens within our state and our cities and local governments, but also in our courts, both national and local, not to mention the changeover in federal government. And so tonight we will be talking about all of those issues with the amazing group of people that we have gathered here tonight, Jason, Sandra, and Matt. So because there's so much for us to get through, I want to dive in. But some of the key issues that we will be discussing are what is happening at the federal level with respect to our agenda, what's happening in the courts with respect to an LGBTQ plus agenda for the entire state, and then what's happening in Albany, because even though we are in New York City, we continue to have unfinished business despite the fact that we have a law which proclaims equality for everyone in our state, regardless of sexual orientation, as well as gender identity. And maybe the problems that we continue to have with respect to marginalization, particularly for LGBTQ people, LGBTQ plus people, especially those of color, and even more acutely, those who are trans, points to some of the issues that we will face at the national level if such a law passes. That is to say that even once we have equality, there's still a long way to go and a big agenda ahead. So with that, we will dive right in. Since you have kind of a national perspective, Jason, at HRC, and have combined this experience both at state and national level, I'm wondering if you can tell us about what, from a policy standpoint, will be some of the key things that we should be looking for and fighting for with the new incoming administration.
Sure, and hello everyone. Jason Starr here. I use he and him pronouns. Sorry, that's not in my email signature or my Zoom signature there, but it's really great to be with you with New Pride Agenda, and of course with you, Senator Brooke and Matt. I guess maybe just to set the stage at the federal level. I mean, I think LGBTQ people and communities across the country, hopefully took a collective sigh after the results of the presidential and vice presidential election. I mean, I think one of the key differences coming into January, into the new administration, is we have an administration that has some history of supporting LGBTQ people and LGBTQ communities, of acknowledging that LGBTQ people and trans, gender non-conforming, non-binary people actually exist in our society. And so, unfortunately, we've gone through the last 4 years of really seeing an all-out assault on our very existence. And so I think that's big to name, just in terms of the kinds of conversations we're going to be having, the kinds of expectations we're going to be setting. But the Trump-Pence administration did real damage to the infrastructure of critical protections for LGBTQ folks, whether that's in non-discrimination or in so many other areas or facets of life where the Trump administration keyed in on rolling back critical protections that the Obama-Biden administration had set up. So I think we have these categories. I think we, one, have to just really recognize that we still in 2021 will have no comprehensive federal non-discrimination protections for sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity across a variety of areas of life, like schools, employment, not employment, credit, housing. And so I think the Equality Act as a North Star is something that still has to be top of mind for all of us, because so much of the work that we have to do on the executive side with the Biden-Harris administration is as a result of not having legislation. And so I think that for us at HRC, really centering the legislative effort and making sure that we have those explicit protections across a variety of areas of public life are going to be critically important. But we also have to start the business of undoing the regulatory environment that the Trump administration created. And that looks, I think, really most critically at issues like HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, and what they've done to roll back protections for LGBTQ people in healthcare, looking at issues like Title X, which really are preventing some of our key LGBTQ community health providers like Planned Parenthood from providing critical care to LGBTQ folks. Title IX interpretations, which is keeping LGBTQ students in public schools and college campuses unprotected from discrimination, sexual harassment, and closing off those avenues. So we've got to do the work on the Hill for sure to make sure that we get the federal legislation that we've been fighting for that would cover some of these issues and concretize our protections into federal law, while at the same time playing whack-a-mole around all of the ways in which the Trump administration used the agencies, executive orders, et cetera, to roll back critical rights in the short term. So I think that's what our work looks like, especially as we lean into engaging with the administration in these first 100 days.
Yeah, I actually recently, a couple of weeks ago, did a video op-ed for Now This, where I was talking about the comprehensive nature and the systemic nature, specifically on trans issues, but our issues writ large, but specifically on trans issues, whereby they have weaponized every single department in the government against trans people. So denying equal access to healthcare, saying that schools don't have to protect trans kids, banning trans people from the military. So as you say, it's about rolling all of that back. And then on top of that, trying to fight for a civil rights act, essentially for our community, which is what the Equality Act is, which would say that civil rights laws apply to us, which is not, as you said, set in the law. So there's a really big, ambitious agenda there. Before we move on to talk about the way in which these issues play out at the state, and then what the community of funders and nonprofits are thinking about, I'm wondering if you can just talk about the various stages of litigation that are at the national level. So for example, the Supreme Court just declined to hear a case that would have overturned gay marriage in the country, but there are all types of those lawsuits that have been filed that have been encouraged by the Trump administration that are working their way through the courts. And I'm wondering what your focus is on that and what you have to say about all of that, which is still going to continue after January 20th.
Yeah, absolutely. In the case you referenced, the Supreme Court denied, hearing is a case out of Indiana that challenged the right of same-sex parents to be listed as birth parents on a birth certificate. And so I think what that case sort of indicates with respect to what we might be seeing is, an attack on the fundamental right to marriage. And perhaps the court won't go as far as to overturn Obergefell, but I think you're going to start to see cases, or continue, I should say, to see cases that chip away at what the court in Obergefell really said was a fundamental right to marriage and a fundamental right to the marriage institution, because there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other benefits throughout our law that is tied to marriage. And so I think we see those cases. And I must say that one area that we are particularly worried about is non-discrimination as opposed to what's being framed as religious liberty, right? And so you see a case like Fulton versus the city of Philadelphia, which the Supreme Court just heard shortly after, I think the day after the election, where Catholic Social Services sought an exemption to non-discrimination requirements to a government contract whereby it certified families or homes for foster for foster children. And so I think, because so many religiously affiliated organizations are providing critical social services, are part of our social safety net, are receiving taxpayer funds, are being subject to non-discrimination laws in areas of public life, that what you see is a really concerted effort to utilize religion and religious liberty, not as a shield, but rather to utilize that protection as a sword and a license to discriminate. And again, whether that be in the context of the social safety net, whether that be in the context of medical care and healthcare, which we're seeing a lot, we see the court giving a lot of life to those in setting up LGBTQ equality and non-discrimination is somehow hostile to or inconsistent with religious practice, when in fact the public data and polling don't support that. And we know and can identify this small group of special interests who are utilizing, one of the fundamental tenets of our democracy, and that is the freedom to believe and to practice your belief, as somehow inconsistent with a basic tenet that we should, the government especially, should treat all people equally and provide for the protection of all people without reservation. So I think those are the things that we're seeing in the court. Those are the things we're worried about given the makeup of the federal judiciary, and ways in which we're going to have to think about how we're going to come together as community to really stand against and oppose this notion that LGBTQ people or LGBTQ advocacy is somehow hostile to religious liberty or practice.
Right. So, and I think that, it's just important for everyone to, for us to kind of underscore again, which is that, we have now a majority on the court, which seem to be, have voted or indicated that they are hostile to some, if not all, parts of our community. And then, if memory serves correct, I believe that Donald Trump has appointed more than 25% of the federal district court judges. So there's going to be, the courts are going to be a difficult terrain potentially for us, on top of all of the other things that we spoke about.
Yeah, we're playing keep away from the federal courts as much as we can, and really looking to state courts and frankly to legislatures to really make sure we can avoid some of the things that you are that you raise.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so that does lead us to states and state courts, which takes us to Sandra Brooke, who is the newly elected state senator for, I believe, the 55th district in New York. So first of all, Sandra, congratulations. And as you come into your state Senate seat, I'm wondering, what are some of the priorities that your constituents in a part of the state that is not downstate, that is not, the lower Hudson Valley, has said are priorities with respect to LGBTQ plus people at the state level?
Yeah, thank you so much. And also, I just have to say, I'm sitting here taking notes, even listening to Jason about a lot of what's happening federally, and the constant fight that it seems we're always fighting. We get the casual once in a while reprieve that we get to celebrate, but anyone who's in the work, as you all are, knows that there's always another mountain to climb. So it's an honor and a privilege to be here with all of you, as in a staunch and loud ally and advocate for our LGBTQ community, especially here in Western New York. One thing I want to point out, as we were just talking about, the appointments and the judges, and the fact that we did get this flip on the Supreme Court, which I'm sure most of us on this call were not celebrating, nor should it have happened. But there is this bright light in New York State that we now have two powerful supermajority Democratic chambers. And I'm not one for fully partisan politics. I ran as a progressive Democrat, but more so because that has traditionally been the party, certainly here in New York State, that has been there to support and champion these causes. And so I like that Jason teed it up perfectly. We didn't even plan that. But I have said throughout the COVID crisis and throughout the uncertainty that the outgoing president created, that the states can act as this barrier to protect where the federal government in many cases abdicated their duties to protect some of our most vulnerable and marginalized populations who weren't getting services they needed. And so I think that that is an opportunity that New York State has now to really practice what we preach, or walk the walk that we've talked over the campaign season, and really be able to move the needle. And also, hopefully now work in tandem with the federal government, willing to talk about these issues and willing to undo and then continue moving forward with a lot of these things. So all of that said, here in Western New York, you got it right, it's the 55th district. And one of the most interesting things, perhaps why I'm here today, is because we do have urban parts, we've got suburban parts, we've got rural parts. I cross over 2 counties. My grandparents live in the rural part, so on the way to their house, it's, there's a lot of cows and farmland and the beautiful Finger Lakes region. And I live up here in the city of Rochester, and obviously it's a little bit different as I look out my window, although everything's covered in snow today, so that's the one similarity. But, it was really interesting to, when I was asked about this panel and started digging deeper as I take office in January, but as I prepare, to think about how things are different or how things are the same. And one of the things that really struck me are when we are in these areas that are in some cases not as densely populated, in most cases, especially if you're going to compare it to downstate, not as densely populated, that also means that we oftentimes have fewer resources. Sure, there are fewer people and there's smaller populations, but the danger of that is when one organization or one clinic or one resource goes under, say because COVID losses, right? Or because of lack of federal or state funding, we now have an entire population that's not being served. And so one thing that I'm very focused on, singularly focused, some would say, especially right now, is making sure that we can get funding to our states and to our localities, because without that, it's not, I did live downstate for a little bit, so I know transportation isn't always the easiest. There's always some kind of subway, or at least a lot of things are walkable. Up here, if you don't have a car to drive another 30, 40 miles to get to the neighboring city or town that might have your resources, you're really stuck. And something, I've really noticed is, especially in our more rural areas, oftentimes people don't feel as safe seeking out those resources, right? It's much harder to create community. You have to be so purposeful. And I imagine now, as we're all on Zooms and social distancing, add in the fact that rural broadband isn't nearly as fast as it is in some of our cities, but you really lack that connection. And so one of the things that I really want to do as an ally, and I know I have partners in government who want to do this as well, is to understand some of these unique instances and circumstances for our LGBTQ plus community here in Western New York, and do as much as we can to make sure that funding is getting to those organizations, that funding is getting to these clinics, to make sure that people get what they need, especially right now. But I think the other part of that is also to provide and create a safer space for people to be able to gather, whether virtually or what have you. And as leaders, we can create that, right? We can say, you're not an afterthought. I think especially our trans folks of color, you are the purpose of why we are here, because we know when we make laws that work for you, laws will work for everyone, but oftentimes they're left out. And so, so I'm hoping as leaders we can do that, but also thinking about the nuance of being up here and the kind of support we might need.
Yeah. No, I think that's really important to think about the ways in which people are able to be connected in different ways. Less people, fewer resources, those resources go, that creates huge holes in the community. I'm wondering if any topics have come up with respect to your looming LGBTQ plus constituents. Have issues to the community in particular around housing come up? Has there been any conversation about the need to fully take on the implementation of the state's anti-bullying laws? You know, what about funding gender? What about possibly walking while trans laws? I'm just wondering if what conversations your LGBTQ plus constituents to be might have brought up to you that have stood out to you.
Yeah, I love that question, and thank you, because I missed it in my first statement. But housing is huge. Housing is probably the #1 thing. In fact, we just met with the LGBTQ caucus last week over a Zoom in the Rochester area. And when I posed that exact question, housing was the first thing to come up. You know, we're dealing with an eviction crisis. So we have that, right? We have people who have suffered economic loss. When you're looking at a majority of folks who are, you know, 1 or 2 paychecks away from not being able to pay rent or mortgages. And so housing is huge. It's also, you know, here, not to harp on it, but, you know, for organizations, and this is Matt's world, but in organizations that often help with housing and help with finding shelter and things like that, we've lost some of those. So right now, for our adult LGBTQ population, we don't have a strong support network. Another thing that really came up was discrimination in housing, and the fact that now folks are in more desperate situations, and the last thing we want is to be forced into a situation where you have a discriminating landlord or management company. And so we've had to try to fill in to help navigate. And you just have to think, right? It's a pandemic. As I said, we're dealing with a snowstorm. I think everyone in New York is getting hit. Times are hard. You're already stressed and anxious, and perhaps you don't feel safe even, you know, in your own home. And to not have the supports that you need, and to know that there's nowhere you can go. You know, where's the division? Where's the agency that you can go to say, I need help, you know, with this? And so, so housing is a really, really major concern, and it's something, frankly, that we need to act on. We need to act on it immediately. I mean, every day that someone doesn't have a warm, safe place to go that is secure is a problem, both for the pandemic, but also for the individuals. So housing is certainly something that it's one of those things where if we were to solve it, it would help so many people, but it's also a really big issue here for our LGBTQ community as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And I also should just let our audience know, I know a lot of people tuned in tonight because we had mentioned it in our promotion for this event that Congressman-elect Richie Torres would be on tonight, but now Councilmember Torres, bridging the worlds between the local and Washington right now, had an emergency and is not able to join us tonight. So I just wanted to level set around that piece. So Matt, one of the things that I think I'm curious about is the terrain that Jason has laid out, and State Senator-elect Brook have now laid out, seems to be very, it's not adverse, but it is certainly a challenging one. And I'm wondering what the conversation is for funders of organizations that advocate for LGBTQ plus rights, and also that provide services, what the conversation is amongst funders about what the needs are and what you're hearing are the areas that we need to concentrate on, given just the broad array of challenges right now.
I don't really think it's really funders' position to decide what the needs of the LGBT community are. There's so many and so diverse. I do have to say that there's a perception among national funders that everything's good in New York, and that there's plenty of money in New York to deal with the issues of the queer community. And that really works against us, because it's not true in New York City, and it's certainly not true upstate. And that breaking through for people to understand the complexity of New York, or even the complexity of California. People feel the same way about California, but there's a lot more funders actually in California that are investing in LGBT services and advocacy than there are in New York. And it's a bias against New York, and it's also the foundation world in New York, which is the largest, segment in our entire philanthropic world, is not very pro-gay. It's very sad. People have to beg and scrape for just little tiny grants, and I think that's what it really requires. I think is some very aggressive advocacy from on-the-ground groups to go to the larger foundations in New York and say, "What's up?" They say, "Well, we don't do gay rights. We don't do LGBT issues." It's like, well, healthcare is an LGBT issue, and you do healthcare. Violence is an LGBT issue, and you do violence. You could go down the list. It's just most of our groups are too under-resourced to come up with that kind of strategy, and don't have the connections to get a door open for them, because I'm convinced that if a door is open with the right strategy, there would be more money. But there's a myth that our community is well-resourced, our organizations, know exactly what they're doing, and they don't, because they're broke, most of them. I mean, even our largest ones are really struggling on a daily basis, which, comes to both what the senator brought up and Jason's world, which is the LGBT Health and Human Services funding that started in 1996 has been a core backbone for health and human services funding for organizations. I think it started out at $2 million. I think it's at $5 million. That's an incredibly long time to go from just 2 to 5. And so now that we have a supermajority, and I know New York State is broke, as most states are, but there is an avenue that could directly, and has in the past been, the lifeblood of the community center in Rochester or the community center in Buffalo. So that's one very immediate thing that can be done in New York in this next budget cycle. And I know every penny is going to be hard to come by, but there's been historical underfunding of the LGBT community. And now, in DC, with the changed administration, administration will now put LGBT in federal requests for proposals, as opposed to Xing them out of every single proposal that went out. Not even acknowledges there is an opportunity, but here again, from my experience, it's a question of having the resources to know how to go to DC to apply for a grant, and it's not that hard. But here again, there are intricacies to it, and this is a place where I think our federal delegation, which is very powerful, could really help out by providing resources, not lots, but to help LGBT organizations in New York identify federal funding streams and help them apply for it. Or point, that's, and then I just have to say, we have a powerful delegation. We need a federal civil rights law. We've been at this since 1973, when Bella Abzug introduced what is virtually the same thing as the Equality Act now. And have we seen a federal law? No, we haven't. And right now, it's hung up on issues that Jason mentioned, this pitting of our issues against religious liberty. But we have the votes in the Senate to pass this, absolutely. I'm not saying the Equality Act, we have the votes in the Senate to pass a federal non-discrimination law. What we don't have right now is the willingness of people to come together and compromise on key issues. There are good people. Not all people that are advocates of religious liberty are bad people or anti-LGBT. Yeah, there's some on the extreme, the people that Jason was talking about, but there are people in the middle that we could work with, and we really need Chuck Schumer to be at the forefront of this and not let our issues be used as a political game, which is where it's been for the last 20 years. Gotcha, gotcha, gotcha. It's time to break through that.
Yeah, there's so much of what you said that's really important. One of the things I want to press on, though, is just two aspects. One, when you have conversations with your colleagues who are funders, and you say what you just said, I'm wondering, one, what you hear, what do they say to you? And two, my question wasn't so much about funders driving priorities. It's much more, what are you hearing from people who need support? That is to say, from the ground up, what are some of the issues or funding requests that come up? But it may just be, you know, as you say, we're short of resources, and that's the conversation. So I'm just wondering if you could just unpack those two pieces a little bit.
Well, the number of foundations that support LGBT issues in a significant way, whether it be policy advocacy or human services, is tiny. And it's grown a lot, but it's still tiny, tiny, tiny. It's less than 15 cents for every foundation dollar is going to something LGBT. And I do feel that foundations, rightfully so, I think, look at the South. There's a big push on the South and LGBT issues, because if we think that it's a desert, as Cynthia said about upstate New York, it's a sub-Saharan, you know, in many parts of the South, and that has made a real difference. But I have to say, the more I'm at this, the more I'm convinced that homophobia is really at the core of this lack of funding, and it's people don't get us. They don't get how discrimination is still a daily factor in our people's lives, and not obviously trans people, and you know, obviously people of color, but the entire community. I mean, there was just a survey that CAP did over the summer showing younger people, 1 in 3 have experienced serious acts of discrimination. Younger people in the last year. There's this myth, I think, that everything's good for LGBT people and we can get married now and we're all white and we're privileged, and so I don't know how to break through that, because I've been chipping away at it for 13 years, and I don't know, I feel like a failure.
I mean, I think that a part of it is where you started, which is that when you actually look at the figures of our community, all those stereotypes about our community are actually false, right? That, you know, LGBTQ plus people are better educated, that we have, you know, higher incomes, all the rest of it. That's actually just false. But part of it is probably the gay people that these decision makers have access to, and that the solution is for us to find a way to give more resources to grassroots organizations that are in frontline communities, like the 55th District in Rochester, to be able to go and tell their stories and advocate for their communities in these places, to help shift the perception, because it sounds like that's a big part of what you're saying, we're battling against, is this perception of who's being heard and who's not heard, and that having people think that our community doesn't need anything, which is false. That's false. It's not true. One question that's come in that that intersects across all of you all, and so it'd be great to hear everyone's perspective about this, and you can just kind of, I'll start kind of the order in turn, but there's a question of whether or not HRC or other LGBTQ plus organizations are working to organize the progressive religious voices, given this conversation around religious liberty. So I'm wondering, maybe if you could kick us off, Jason, and then we'll come back to you, Matt, since it's about LGBTQ plus organizations, and then Samra, if you want to close us out on this question. So Jason, what's HRC doing with progressive religious voices?
Excuse me, great question, and I'm glad that it got sort of integrated into this conversation, because I think it is really important. Matt, you made a great point where sometimes I think the religious extremists that we see, the political right, religious right, as sometimes we refer to them, often take the place or have the voice of religion or religious leaders or religious or faith communities writ large. And as you mentioned, that's just not the case. That's a loud, vocal, well-financed minority, but not the way that people of faith think about these issues. And so we have a religion and faith program, wonderful director. His name's Mike Vasquez. You should definitely look him up. He's a progressive Catholic himself. And we've moved over this year from some of our sort of community engagement work to essentially working with faith leaders who were providing mutual aid during COVID, and then who were also on the front lines during the racial justice uprising of the summer. And so the program trajectory shifted a bit because now we had this wonderful like cadre of folks that we were connected to in that way, who are, you know, for lack of a better term, politicized. And I'm using that term just to mean sort of activated around the importance of organizing as faith communities, as faith leaders, progressive faith communities and faith leaders, to provide an alternative voice to us out there. I mean, I'm a Christian, and what I learned and how I practice my faith and how I see myself in it is drastically different. But I do find myself sitting in this sort of challenging position of being open about my Christian values and what it taught me and what it learned versus what people perceive Christian conservatism, political Christianity, I guess, if you will. So we are keen on building on those relationships, building into the organizing that's happening with progressive faith leaders, and also trying to make sure as an organization that does have you know, strong communications channels, that is engaged in advocacy to the court, that we're figuring out ways to amplify those voices on our platforms and channels, so that people of faith themselves are talking to faith communities, to other people of faith, about why non-discrimination, why LGBTQ equality is not inconsistent with matters of faith, but in many ways consistent with the ways in which people of faith have shown up for and built supportive communities for people in need. So that's just a little bit of how we're trying to engage progressive faith leaders.
Perfect. Matt, what are your thoughts on this? And do religious organizations come in for funding to work with LGBTQ plus communities, those that are progressive, or what are your general thoughts on this area?
I think it's a much bigger issue of, you know, how right-wing religion has become so politicized and progressive religion is so far behind and trying to catch up. And that goes across every issue. I think for our issue, yes, we have solid support among those, you know, progressive churches, mainline Protestants, et cetera. They don't wield a lot of power anymore on Capitol Hill. That's just the reality. Used to be what Episcopalians were a third of the members of Congress. Well, those days are long gone. But I do think a critical religious force that we should move towards and be in more communication with aren't the right wing, but are conservative Christians, such as the Orthodox Union, such as the LDS Church, such as the Council on Christian Colleges, a coalition of Christian colleges and universities. These are people that I say I do believe are good-hearted people, and they want to address the issue of LGBT non-discrimination. They want to get this off their plate. Now, whether they want to get it off their plate, for example, the LDS Church, because they've taken such a beating on it, and they may see the writing on the wall that if the Equality Act passed today in its current form, it would have monumental financial repercussions for every Catholic hospital in this country, for Brigham Young University, for Bob Jones University, all of these institutions that would not exist but for federal funding. And I think we forget that we have, as a nation, somehow allowed ourselves to become, our tax dollars going to religious institutions that discriminate against people. Catholic hospitals will not perform even a life-saving abortion, right? We've allowed pharmacists not to dispense even Plan B because they have some kind of religious exemption. We have allowed this to happen, but the reality is now we have these enormous institutions, multi-billion-dollar industries that live off of federal tax dollars, and they don't want to lose that, right? So they want to codify their status now. And I'm saying at the same time, I really do believe the institutions I mentioned do care about LGBT people. They don't want to be vilified for being LGBT. So that's a force on. They are forces on the hill, and they are people I think we should be more willing to talk to, and less demonizing of anyone who isn't on the left of Christianity. So
yeah, and State Senator-elect Brook, it's such a great phrase. I'm wondering at the local level, what do you hear from religious institutions around LGBTQ plus issues? Do you hear both pro and con? Is it mainly one or the other? Is the conversation more nuanced than it is at the national level? I'm curious as to how these issues play out at a local level.
So I have to start with, I grew up Episcopalian, which, as you all just learned through Matt's story, I grew up in a very pro LGBTQ community, church community. That is how religion was introduced to me as a child. And incidentally, most of the churches I went to are actually in the district I'm representing now. And I've had, that's always been part of my religious experience. And so it is interesting to have that base and to go back into the religious community, whether it's to talk about these issues or other issues, just as part of community outreach. And you know what I think it is, Amara? I think, on a grand scale, in media, when you think of like this publicly large scope, 30,000 foot view, it is easier to get more divided. And it's easier to say like, you're here. But the truth is when you get hyper local, and this is why, with states, government, the districts are small enough that I did go door to door. I had a good chunk of folks, or at least call the call, I guess, during COVID. But everything is more nuanced when you're here. Like when you're here looking at someone in their eye and talking to them, it's always more nuanced. It's so much harder to spew, whether it's homophobia or, hate, like whatever it is. And so I love that you set it up like that, because it is. I've had conversations specifically with like UUs and other congregations, and a lot of the Protestant congregations here that are fantastic allies. And I know that if we needed them, if we have to rally folks to show support for a bill and show a mandate to the state government, I know we would have allies. But I will be honest, the other side of that are, it's not contentious per se, but it is a lack of enthusiasm for supporting these issues. And the situation as I meet with leaders is one that I do kind of agree with Matt in that I think there's movement there. I think that they're movable, but I'm telling you, it's going to take so much education and, just repetitive interaction. And I'm up for it. I mean, that's why I wanted to do this work. And, you will give me my charge, as I am the ally here. You give me my charge, and I want to fight for it and do that education, because too much of the onus falls on the communities themselves so often. And having those conversations, but certainly there is friction, locally. It doesn't look as polarizing as perhaps on a national level. But I have to do a plug, because you talked about federal, and like obviously everyone thinks about the federal level so much, and I'm sitting here chomping at the bit for just wanting to point out, when Matt, you talked about the fact that we've allowed these institutions to be massive, and they've been here for decades, and the loss of them would be great, whether it's for the people employed, for the institutions themselves and the stakeholders. And I understand that, and I can acknowledge that. I also think, and I think you've also both said that, all three of you had said this, we still need people with the will and the courage to say, that might happen, and it's still the right thing to do. Right? I mean, everything that the presidential, primaries talked about, whether healthcare, all these different major issues, there's always going to be some version of this institution might not look the same as it used to, right? But we've got to have people that are courageous enough to say, yes, and if we want to continue progressing as the nation that we all hope to be someday, we have to make those hard decisions. So that's my pressure on the federal folks. And I'll continue to put that pressure. But just to, that was my reaction. I had to put that out there from Matt's comment.
I hear you, and but look at the profiles and courage, or lack thereof, of the past 4 weeks, right? These people are, and they're not, and I would like to say differently, they're not going to go anywhere in the near term. They solidified their hold on state houses across the country. And it's so that I just try to deal, and here we have the reality of this. Yes, it's wonderful, me personally, that we have a new administration in DC, but the entrenched racist, misogynist, homophobic, thoughtless people really but that's where we are. And I'm getting old. I want to see this done before I pass, which isn't that far off, I don't think. So
that's pessimistic. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Jason.
Well, one thing I wanted to mention, just on the funding stuff, like generally, because, our economy is in a free fall, and, I guess $2.3 to $2.5 trillion and I guess they call it stimulus money, but I call it salvation money because, it didn't stimulate anything. It just, kept the bottom from falling out more than it already did, right? And we're looking at somewhere like around 900 billion going forward, in what might be a end of the year package. But we're going to be in January, and we're still going to need more direct aid at the federal level, like we haven't seen before. And we're going to have to resist the conversation around the debt. We can deal with that when our economy is growing, when people are at work, when we have a surplus. We can talk about looking at austerity, but you don't do that when we are in the situation we are in now at the federal level, or frankly at the state level. The federal level, they have the benefit of printing money. We can't do that in New York State, but they can at the federal level. So we just really need to be open and honest about, I think, the kind of direct aid we're going to need to individuals, to state and local governments, and to small business. And I would like to think of it as community resiliency money. And when I think, Senator Brooke, you're talking about Rochester, and, I think about places like the House of Mercy and St. Joseph's and the Mocha Center. And those are places where like community solutions exist. Those are the places that showed up when government didn't in March and in April, and made sure that people had food, and had clothing, and that there was community network, so people knew how to demonstrate they needed need, and people who had, like, all of that is the ways that our community is resilient. It's not just building a seawall on Staten Island. That's important too. It's a physical geography, but it's also our community infrastructure. And we've got to fight for funding that makes its way to community-oriented solutions, to make sure that we have an LGBTQ center in the Southern Tier and in the North Country, so that those resources are there for people for whom there is nothing else. And we also have to think about our demands as an LGBTQ polity, not also including things like anti-poverty and social service and safety net measures. I mean, we need that kind of direct aid to take care of rent arrears and mortgage arrears is an LGBTQ issue, because LGBTQ people, particularly Black and Brown LGBTQ people, experience poverty at higher rates. So I think the funding conversation is like so important, and something that the federal administration and our state and local electeds, our New York delegation, all are going to really have to work together to present a robust request on behalf of all New Yorkers that disrupts this mindset that, you know, New York State is flush with money, and New York State writ large is flush with resources and coverage already. And I'll say one more thing in that effort with regard to appointments and representation. Remember, it's not just the diversity piece, but it's the equity and the inclusion piece. And I think the administration coming in are demonstrating they may be doing a little bit better on the diversity piece, but it remains to be seen on the equity and inclusion piece. We're focused on cabinet secretaries. We're focusing on high-ranking senior appointments. We're looking at federal court judges, appellate judges, and Supreme Court judges. But as someone who worked for an executive and who sat at the table with the Division of Budget, who sat at the table with the administrators across the agencies, we need to be focusing on downstream appointments. Who are going to be those undersecretaries, those budget peoples in OMB? Not only are they going to be LGBTQ people of color, but are they going to be LGBTQ people that did not graduate from college, LGBTQ people that live in poverty? Because I think you have to have people across the functions of government, across the places and spaces where bureaucrats sit, that have a disruptive mentality, that are able to understand and sit across from the community that they themselves are a part of and have relationship with, experiences that they have. I look at somebody like Cori Bush and incoming Congresswoman Cori Bush, who talked about not being able to afford a wardrobe on the Hill. That's the kind of diversity we need, not the surface level, but really digging deep into really different kinds of people and saying they are qualified for service and they're necessary for us to build a kind of political infrastructure that's going to have the outputs that really meet our community's 21st century needs.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to get to, and I think that we covered about as much as is possible over the past hour from so many different perspectives. I think everyone watching has a sense of how the election is impacting where we are, what our agenda is, from so many different perspectives. And, you know, again, each of you has just underscored how much work there is to be done and what is going to be needed at every level of government for us to make progress in the next year. So on behalf of the New Pride Agenda, I wanted to thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you, Amada.
Thank you.